Good morning, eighth graders. So I first want to just remind you, if you haven't already, please complete your weather log for the day and then come back and let's continue on with Earth's atmosphere. So Earth's atmosphere. Before we really start talking about weather and everything else that's going on with weather, we need to talk about where all of this is taking place, and that is all within Earth's atmosphere. So we are working with Middle School Earth Science Standard 2-6, which states that you will be able to develop and use a model to describe how the energy transfer impacts atmospheric and oceanic circulations that determines regional climate. So basically by the end of this mini lecture, you should be able to describe the makeup of each layer in our atmosphere, identify the temperature of the layer and their correlations with one another, as well as order the layer of our atmospheres and describe the importance of each layer. Because we wouldn't have multiple layers if they didn't play some sort of specific role in keeping us in a livable state. So make sure you have these notes in front of you and let's get going. So what is an atmosphere? We are not the only planet that has an atmosphere. So an atmosphere is just a thin layer of gases surrounding a planet. In this case, we're going to talk about Earth. So this is the thin layer of gases that surround our Earth, constantly around us. We don't see them because we don't see gases, but it is what we breathe in. It's the wind moving, all that sort of stuff. So why is our atmosphere important? Well, our atmosphere is important because it is a specific density, and our density slightly changes as we go through our atmosphere, but it plays the roles of UV protection. So basically making it to where that all that UV radiation that comes from the sun doesn't instantaneously like melt us. It contains all of the necessary gases that allow us to live and breathe. It contains a majority of our water, and it keeps our water here on Earth. It regulates our temperatures to where, yes, it gets very, very cold in the winter and very warm in the summer, but the Earth is constantly in a balance of good temperature versus bad temperature. And then it influences our weather. It contains our weather, all of that sort of stuff. So the atmosphere is important for all these things, plus I'm sure many, many more. But these are the 5 that we're going to kind of focus in on for this little lecture. So how did we move from our ancient atmosphere to today's atmosphere? Our ancient atmosphere, we talked a little bit back with geologic time, but it was much, much cooler back then. It was even much, much warmer, but overall it was much cooler. Once we started warming up to the correct temperature, and by correct I mean like the correct for sustaining life, we started seeing water vapor start to condense and causing it to rain and rain and rain some more, to where we were starting to get like H2O both in, or not both, but in all 3 states of matter. And like I told y'all, like with the last water cycle stuff, Earth is so interesting in the fact that it is the only planet that has all 3 states of matter for water versus no other planet has that. So once we start getting rain, we start getting photosynthetic organisms that are like able to start doing what they need to do, taking in that extra CO2 or carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, which allows multicellular animals to start to like evolve and produce more and more young in order to get the necessary life that we have today. So we had to evolve with our atmosphere, and it wasn't until our atmosphere changed in certain ways that multicellular animal life was able to actually develop. Now, Our atmosphere is made up in weird percentages. And I only say weird because we sit here and we're like, you need oxygen. But oxygen only makes up 21% of our entire atmosphere. 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, which by itself, yes, would suffocate us because our bodies just don't break down nitrogen the same way that it breaks down oxygen. And then you get that last 1% that is within our atmosphere that is different things like water vapor and argon and carbon dioxide and ozone. Ozone is different than oxygen. Oxygen is O2, ozone is O3. So a little bit of difference there. But we do take in all of that nitrogen, oxygen, and then a little bit of everything else, but our body is only able to absorb that oxygen. So it's sitting at a perfect balance for what our lungs can do versus what other organisms are able to. Because remember, the plants need the carbon dioxide, and our atmosphere is only 1% carbon dioxide. So they have adapted to do with it as they need. So that's our atmosphere kind of sort of in a nutshell. So if you're continuing on with lecture notes, fabulous, stay tuned. If you are breaking off into other styles of notes, please remember your CHAMPS expectations as you keep moving through. And yeah, we'll start from there. So let's talk about the layers of our atmosphere. Just like there are multiple layers within our Earth itself, remember we have the crust, the mantle, and then the mantle can be broken down into the lithosphere versus the asthenosphere, then the outer core and the inner core, all of this fun jazz. Same thing happens with our atmosphere. To where starting at the surface, we go troposphere, ozone layer, which is within our stratosphere, mesosphere. We get the Kármán line, but we don't really talk about the Kármán line. The thermosphere, and then you get the exobase, which we also call the ionosphere, and then we get the exosphere. Okay, things like that. There are so much more happening up above our heads than we even can imagine. But the most important thing that we have to kind of sort of take out of this is everything happens within a very specific layer because of what's happening within those layers. So we have to remember that troposphere is where our weather's happening. That's where we happen. We don't live beyond the troposphere. Okay, then we get into the ozone layer and we talk about that a lot, especially for the rest of the year, about how like the ozone's depleting and all this or whatnot. We also talk about the stratosphere is where we get a lot of our weather data and things like that, which is weird because weather happens in the troposphere, and so on and so forth. Okay, but what we have to kind of keep in mind with all of this is as we go up through our atmosphere, we start to see some really weird changes in either our temperature or our air pressure, things like that. So bear with me as we kind of move through all of this. We're going to break each layer down a little bit and talk about them more cohesively. So the troposphere. This is from the Earth's surface to about 15 kilometers above Earth's surface. So it goes beyond Mount Everest, which is the tallest point that humans are able to go. All life occurs within the troposphere. All weather occurs in the troposphere. But we have to kind of sort of think about it as we move our way up into our troposphere. So as you climb Mount Everest, the temperature in the troposphere starts to drop as soon as you start leaving Earth's surface. Okay, this is why like you go out to Colorado or anywhere with mountains, and even in June, July, you still have some white-capped mountains because they're at higher altitudes within our troposphere and it's much cooler up there. So we have that. So as you increase in altitude, you decrease in temperature. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Okay? On top of that, as you increase in altitude, you're also decreasing in air pressure. So this just means that there's a little less, because we talked about gravity, so a little less gravity actually pulling you down because you're getting further away from the core of the Earth, which is what's pulling us down. Okay, but within that, that means that the air thins out. Oxygen isn't able to hang out in very thin atmosphere. To where that's why you'll notice when people climb Mount Everest, they'll bring oxygen tanks. And for the last like bit of it before you summit, they actually have to wear oxygen tanks in order to not die of suffocation, or not alive. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So we decrease, or there's less air pressure the higher you go into our troposphere. So as we increase in altitude, we decrease in temperature and decrease in air pressure. Okay, there's that. So right above our troposphere, we have our stratosphere. Our stratosphere is about, now these are all about numbers, about 15 kilometers to about 50 kilometers above Earth's surface. Now, the stratosphere is important for the fact that the stratosphere is what contains our ozone layer. And our ozone layer is this kind of like standalone but within layer that is responsible for absorbing as much of the ultraviolet light that's coming to us from the sun. So that, again, when we interact with ultraviolet light, our like skin cells and other cells start to mutate, and not always in the best ways. Sometimes we see that in the form of like sunburn. That is technically cell destruction or mutation to our skin cells. But other not so nice things can happen. But because all of this UV radiation is essentially being caught up here and somewhat reflected back, as you increase in altitude throughout the stratosphere, the temperature also increases. And this is because, again, that ozone layer is kind of absorbing this ultraviolet light and reflecting some of it back. Okay, our air pressure continues to decrease as we move from Earth's surface all the way up. Our air pressure decreases because, again, you're moving further away from the core of the Earth, which is where the most gravitational pull is happening. Okay. UV lighter radiation can cause DNA damage in plants and animal cells. And we see this as sunburn, but it can, on a larger level, start to mutate more. And this is where you get like melanoma or skin cancers, things like that. So we have to be extra, extra careful when we are out in the sun. And this is why we're tracking UV radiation, so we can kind of see what sorts of patterns people who live in those areas may need to be aware of. The mesosphere. The mesosphere is the prettiest of them all, I think. So the mesosphere is about 50 kilometers to about 85 kilometers above Earth's surface. As you increase in altitude, you decrease in temperature once again. We don't have any layer that's like absorbing all of this extra like UV radiation and things like that. But within the mesosphere, we do have what is called the ionosphere. It overlaps ever so slightly, and this is where some of our temperature can maybe start to increase a bit. And that's because within our ionosphere, our atmosphere is starting to burn up space particles. So space debris that just kind of gets thrown around, whether that is solar flares or little meteors and things like that coming within our atmosphere. The ionosphere starts to break it up. But with specific solar storms and all these extra particles, we have this burning up and then it emits light because we're still getting rid of energy. And those lights come to us as aurora borealis, or our northern lights. So we get a little bit of a temperature increase as we go through that ionosphere, but as we move in altitude through our mesosphere, our temperature decreases. As we move through our ionosphere, our temperature increases. Okay, a little bit of a pattern so far. Then we have our thermosphere. So this is like where the ionosphere kind of like goes, like it blends between our mesosphere and into our thermosphere. So about 85 kilometers to about 500 kilometers. This is probably one of our thickest layers of our Earth. And because this one is primarily there to break down meteors and other space debris and junk that's coming in toward our atmosphere, it increases in temperature as you increase in altitude, because it's burning up all this excess stuff, just causing for a lot of excess like heat. So that's the thermosphere. Finally, we have our exosphere. So this one is a really, really rough about. So this is that weird blurry line between where our atmosphere ends and our space begins. So scientists have judged anywhere between 500 to 1,000 kilometers above Earth's surface. But again, it kind of sort of depends on who you talk to. We know that there is an exosphere. We know this because there is just enough gravitational pull in this most outer layer where we are able to send up satellites, and our satellites don't leave Earth. They stay in this last layer. So all of our satellites that we've ever put out into space have stayed within the exosphere. They haven't left. Temperature increases, but it feels cold due to the little to no gases. So it increases in the sense of this is where you start to feel whatever ultraviolet light and radiation the sun is emitting. This is where you start to feel this versus the super duper cold space. But because there's so few gases, you don't always feel that temperature difference, and all that sort of stuff. So there is this layer. We don't know exactly how thick it is because it's like, well, where does like blue stop being blue and now it starts getting into cerulean or something like that. Okay, so exosphere. Satellites hang out here. So air pressure is at the highest. Okay, we talked about this as we went through. Air temperature is the highest, or sorry, air pressure is the highest the closest to the Earth's surface you are. Okay, because you're at that really weird point of the sun's trying to pull you toward it because that's what the sun's gravitational pull does, but you're close enough to the Earth's core, even though it's much, much smaller, it's trying to pull you down. So your air pressure is at its highest at the Earth's surface, but it decreases as you move further away from the Earth's surface. So we can see in this depiction, we have Mount Everest, which is 8.8 kilometers tall, and we say that the troposphere ends between 10 and 13. We said 14, 15 or whatever, but it decreases up here because you're getting further away from the surface. So you're at like less than, what were they saying? I don't know. But your air pressure is significantly lower the higher you are up here versus at sea level, very, very, like, not very strong, but normal strong. Versus if you think when we dive into the ocean, we're technically getting closer to the Earth's core. That's where we start to see troubles with submarines and things like that, is that they're not strong enough to withhold all that pressure that the excess water and the gravitational pull from Earth is creating. So focusing on atmosphere though, as you increase in altitude, you decrease in air pressure. Okay? Now, temperature is a little bit different because the different layers do different things, which can either increase their temperature or decrease their temperature. So we have the troposphere and the mesosphere, where as you increase in altitude, you decrease in temperature. Okay? Remember, the troposphere is where we live. The mesosphere is up above the stratosphere. But the stratosphere and the thermosphere and the exosphere technically have increases in temperature as you increase in altitude, and this is because of the jobs that they're doing. So the stratosphere has the ozone, which is absorbing all of this extra UV radiation. The thermosphere and the exosphere are receiving a lot of direct heat and radiation from the sun, as well as the thermosphere being the first line of defense for any space debris to get broken up and things like that. So increase in altitude, depending on the layer, you either increase in temperature or decrease in temperature. And it kind of goes every other. It kind of does a fun like zigzag sort of a thing. So decrease in temperature through the troposphere, increase throughout the stratosphere. Decrease in the mesosphere, increase in the thermosphere. Okay, so those are the layers of our atmosphere and all of their special jobs that they do to keep life sustained with where we are. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask your teachers. We're here for help. There is a check-in that follows this. If you have any questions on that, let us know. Awesome. Thanks all.